Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode on the TMJ podcast. Today we are speaking with the renowned Professor Mohammad Marandi, an Iranian-American academic and political analyst. He is also a professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran, and he joins me today in breaking down the situations unfolding in Syria and the ripple effects we should expect to see in the West Asia region and globally. Professor Marandi, thank you again for joining us on TMJ News. And just to get right into it, I want to start off with an overview of what we are actually seeing unfold in Syria since the fall of Bashar Al-Assad. Now we're at a stage where al-Julani, the reinvented al-Julani, that is, the one with the suit and tie, is meeting with Western officials, is promising them that he is on their side. And Western officials, in return, are completely ignoring the fact that this man had a $10 million bounty on his head and up until just recently was labeled as an Islamist and a terrorist. What do you make of these most recent developments?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. He was always working with the Americans and NATO. And even when he had a bounty on his head, they ignored it. And they were constantly in contact with one another and in cooperation. And now senior American officials are acknowledging that they allowed him to do what he was doing and did not prevent him from working against the Syrian government. For the Iranians, I think it's pretty clear that their number one concern is the Israeli regime. Anything that benefits the Israeli regime is not beneficial to the region. And West Asia and North Africa is an area where U.S. policy, meaning from Iran to Egypt at least,
Right.
and Turkey to Yemen, is a region where all U.S. policies and European policies are devised in a manner which fit with the needs of the Israeli regime. In other words, Israeli needs, Israeli demands, the interests of the Israeli regime are prioritized over American interests or European interests.
Right.
So, for example, the genocide in Gaza, the Holocaust in Gaza, is not in the interest of the Americans or the Europeans because it has destroyed their image across the world. No one any longer believes in Western values or Western civilization or European values or Western support for human rights. They know that the worst violators on this planet are the Europeans and the Americans. They are helping to carry out a Holocaust in front of the cameras, in front of a global audience, something that's unprecedented.
Right.
But since it's in the interest of the Israeli regime, they are forced to support it, arm it, and to give it political cover and media support. In the case of Syria, the same is true. The Israeli regime has always wanted a broken and weak Syria. And from the beginning of the dirty war in Syria, which coincided with what we saw in Libya, the first arms that came into Syria that were brought in by the Americans were transferred from Libya. Of course, Turkey being in the American camp, the Saudis, the Qataris, and others, all of them cooperate. And we saw that the ISIS and Al-Qaeda groups in Syria were backed by the Israeli regime. And in fact, you had both Al-Qaeda, HTS today, and ISIS, remnants of them are members of HTS and their coalition.
Right.
They had bases alongside the occupied Golan, and the Israelis armed them, they treat their wounded, and they'd strike the Syrian Arab army forces that tried to dislodge them from the border area. So the Israelis were actively supporting them. Erdogan was actively supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. In fact, there was a journalist who was murdered in Turkey for exposing this. Serena Shim was reporting from the Turkish border near Ain al-Arab or Bani, saying that they were using World Food Organization trucks to bring in weapons and also troops for ISIS. And then Turkish intelligence declared that she was a spy. And then she went on television, on Press TV, saying that they said that I'm a spy. I'm very worried. I'm not a spy. I'm just reporting. And hours later, she was killed after that live broadcast. She was hit by a truck. And yeah, it was clear that they wanted
Very
to, was
targeted.
Turkish
Yeah.
intelligence wanted to get rid of her.
Mhm.
She's Lebanese-American. She was Lebanese. But what Iran was concerned about was that what the Americans were trying to impose on Syria through Al-Qaeda and ISIS and others was far worse than anything that existed in Syria.
Right.
And so, but the Iranians did not intervene. And this is something that I think many young people should take into consideration. Hezbollah and Iran did not get involved in Syria until 2013, after tens of thousands of Pakistani foreign fighters were brought into Syria.
Mhm.
The same people that then went into Iraq and almost took the country, but thanks to Hezbollah, Iran, and the Ashid, that was the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, they were able to push them back and expel them from Iraq. But they were also advancing on Damascus. And so that's when Iran and Hezbollah got involved, only after tens of thousands of foreign fighters were brought in by NATO and its regional
Right.
proxies. And my frequent trips to Syria over the past decade, I would lecture at universities. I've always felt that Syrian students, those who I were involved with, whatever their feelings were about the Syrian government and former President Al-Assad, their concerns about ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others were much greater. So I don't think that something that Netanyahu planned and that Biden worked for, and Mr. Erdogan, who has a long history of supporting ISIS, I don't think that that is going to be something that's good for Syria. And so far, that we've seen a lot of new territories occupied by the Israeli regime. Turkey has done nothing. Jolani has done nothing. He's just changed his clothes and now he's wearing a tie. But I think some people, because they are being taught to simply look at it from one angle, and that is the previous Syrian government,
Right.
and since there was not an ideal regime or government, they welcome what's happened. But I think it's sort of like going from the frying pan into the fire.
Absolutely. And since you brought this up, and I think it's relevant, you said you had spoken with Syrian students throughout your trips there. It's a sentiment we see a lot on social media as well, with a lot of Syrians celebrating this, going much further than having criticism of the Assad government itself, and now saying any power that comes to replace him, even if that power is al-Julani and the history we know from him, it doesn't matter. Syrians even celebrating al-Julani and saying because he is a freedom fighter, a lot of his past can be forgiven. And we can look past that because now he is a changed man. And we're seeing these sentiments coming from Syrians. We now see it even coming from Western officials who are considering even taking off the terrorist organization as it was labeled previously. So I kind of want to delve into that as well. Do you think there's any hope that the Syrians themselves will independently be able to choose their future, their government, and choose to not have foreign interference, choose to have their own territorial integrity? Do you think that's a possibility that's still on the table?
Well, a couple of things first. One is that we have to recall that Jolani was the deputy of ISIS, and he also led Al-Qaeda in Syria. And they only split away from Al-Qaeda for PR purposes. And
Right.
when they split, it was with the consent of Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda people were there when they split. This happened 8 years ago, and I tweeted the footage where Jolani praised Al-Qaeda and praised Osama bin Laden and the current head of Al-Qaeda, and it was for the needs of the day in order to get closer to the West and for PR purposes that this was done.
Right.
So to say that ISIS is better than the Syrian government or former Syrian government, I think is uh, one has to be very much influenced by Western propaganda to reach that conclusion. Because again, we have to make a distinction between many of those Syrians who are celebrating, and many are very sincere people, but many are also, they've been influenced by the West for a very long time. Syrians in Damascus, we don't, and elsewhere, we don't know how many are celebrating and how many are worried.
Right.
The minorities are obviously all worried, the Kurds, the Christians, the Alawites, the Druze, the Shia, they're all concerned, but many educated Syrians are not uh, favorable towards Jolani and others. But so we can't say where the majority stands.
Right.
But even if we were to say that the majority supported this, we have to keep in mind that these are people with that background. They are the people. They are the people who were basically Jolani was ISIS. He was a deputy to ISIS, and you know that it was the Islamic State of Iraq, and then they split, and he became Nusra, and Al-Qaeda sided with Nusra instead of the Islamic State of Iraq. It's here, but that's a different story.
Right.
So I don't want to confuse your audience. Where things go from here is very difficult to say,
Right.
because the main reason why the Americans were able to bring down the government in Syria was because they emptied out the economy. They destroyed Syria. The reason why Syrians are so miserable, their lives are so miserable, is because they've lost everything. The Caesar sanctions has brought the economy to its knees. The Americans occupy about 40% of Syria, the northeast of Syria. They occupy the oil wells, they occupy the oil facilities, they occupy the agricultural heartland of Syria. So they steal the oil and the agricultural goods, and they sanction ordinary Syrians. And that's been going on for a very long time. So the economy of Syria is much, much smaller than what it was 15 years ago. In
Right.
2010 and 11, it had a thriving economy despite the drought. But now the economy is destroyed.
Absolutely.
So I think that the future of Syria is going to be full of problems, because the country will need huge amounts of money to rebuild itself. And I don't think Turkey or Qatar are going to put that money into Syria. I don't think the Turks don't have that money, and Qatar can only do so much.
Right.
And also, I think it's going to be a problem for Turkey. I think this is going to be a huge burden for Turkey. It's going to be a cultural problem, because now the jihadists are euphoric. Forget the suit and the tie of Jolani. The others are Al-Qaeda, and some of them are the more extreme, groups that are even worse than Al-Qaeda. So you have these people who are now euphoric. They have influence beyond Syria's borders, and the countries that are more uh, vulnerable to this ideology are all in the American camp.
Right.
So there's going to be a cultural problem in Turkey, or a financial problem for Turkey, and I think that I don't see good days ahead for Syria. Inshallah, inshallah things will work out for Syrians. But when Netanyahu and Erdogan and Biden are all celebrating together, I don't think anyone should think that that is necessarily good news. Remember, Erdogan, during the 14 months of genocide, he was continued to ties, trade continued, oil continued to flow to Netanyahu. So, and those the pipelines that were built from the Caucasus to the Mediterranean, they were all built for Israel, and they were all built during Erdogan's rule in Turkey. So I don't think I think it's very, one must be very naive to think that Mr. Erdogan is sincere about Palestinian resistance.
Absolutely. And we've definitely seen him shift a lot in the past, in the several years, kind of showing support by word and completely doing differently when it comes to matters of foreign policy. And I think one other thing, speaking about, going back to what you were mentioning about how you don't necessarily see there being stability in Syria for a while, I think we can't speak about this without also speaking about the larger resistance in the region. And I think that's also a very important topic because looking at the broader picture here, and you've also mentioned, like many others, that this is a huge setback for the resistance. And some even make the claim that it will mark the end of the resistance as we knew it. But I think you also have a different view about whether or not that's true. What should we expect to see from the resistance powers moving forward in terms of strategy now that Syria, as we knew it under Bashar al-Assad, has fallen?
Well, Bashar al-Assad gradually moved towards the Emirates and the Saudis in his final years of power, and he decreased his cooperation with the resistance substantially. And but I don't want to go into that too much. What has now happened is that Jolani has come to power, and he has basically sent he's saying that we're not going to do anything against Israel,
Right.
and our territory is not going to be used against Israel. So that is not good for Hamas. It's not good for Islamic Jihad. It's not good for the West Bank because support for the West Bank came through Syria, and that's clear. Iran would send support to the West Bank through Syria. That has now stopped. So it's going to be a challenge. Jordan, although of course tried to stop it, but Iran had its ways to do this. Through Lebanon, the same is true. There will be a challenge. So Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, they are in a challenging position. And as I said, Jolani has no intention of taking a stand against the Israeli regime. He hasn't even taken a stand against uh, the occupation of key territory, the water supplies
Right.
close to Damascus, which the country needs badly, as well as the strategic mountain ranges in the south of the country. Jolani is indifferent to them. I think that shows that this partnership between Mr. Erdogan, Netanyahu, and the United States is basically intended to give each of them a piece of the cake, uh, but to destroy the resistance. However, I don't think that this is really going to succeed. I think that Hezbollah is a powerful force, and the Israelis have failed to take territory, despite the fact that they hit Hezbollah very hard. I think that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are continue to resist. And remember, Iran, all of the capabilities of the resistance in Gaza, the West Bank, and in Yemen, they were all provided to them, despite the fact that Iran has no land linked to any of them.
Right.
So it's not as if Iran was sending planes of material to Gaza so that they could build all those tunnel networks and their military capabilities, or the West Bank, or in Yemen, where they have sophisticated missiles and drones that are being used against the Zionist regime. So Hezbollah's infrastructure is intact. They have tunnels across the south and central Lebanon and parts of northern Lebanon, and they will manage. And I also think that Syria is going to evolve. I think that after the initial euphoria of a segment of Syrian society, and I don't know how large they are. And again, in the West, you live in the United States. Let me give you an example, because some things are not representative.
Right.
Something you cannot gauge public opinion by what goes on uh,
The
with a
mainstream.
minority community in the United States. Why? Because, for example, an Iranian or someone who's Lebanese in Europe or the United States, if they are very outspoken in their support for the resistance, let's say, will they be able to get a good job? Will they remain? Will they have no difficulty with the FBI, with the police? Will they be harassed, or will they be allowed to speak out? And we see university students protesting against
Absolutely. Yeah.
the Holocaust, who even Jewish students being harassed and punished as a result of their
Lost.
protests. So
Yeah.
communities, Syrian communities, Iranian communities, Lebanese communities, Arab communities in the West they are those who have political views close to NATO. They, of course, they benefit from expressing themselves. Those who may think otherwise are intimidated, and many of them go quiet, and gradually many of them just become indifferent, or they just move on because they feel that it's dangerous. So what is being said in the United States is not necessarily reflective of what's going on in the ground in Syria. However, I think that I don't believe that the Israelis are going to withdraw. I don't believe that these people are going to. I don't believe that these Al-Qaeda uh, terrorists are going to be able to manage the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Higher Education or the Ministry of Industries or run cities or anything like that. So I think despite some Qatari financial support or Western financial support, I think that gradually people in Syria will will demand that Al Qaeda does not have a stranglehold over the country, and I think that that will probably lead to significant change in Syria.
Absolutely. And kind of before I want to kind of switch over to a theme focusing a little bit more on Iran and its role within the framework of the resistance and now with what we're seeing in Syria. But before that, one point of clarification, we're talking about Hamas and Hezbollah and all of these as though they are one united front, which is definitely how the resistance powers operate as a united front. One thing that has been coming out recently is the fact that we're seeing Hamas leadership celebrate the fall of Bashar al-Assad. And that has raised a little bit of concern in terms of loyalties, because that's different from, for example, Iran's position or Hezbollah's position on what's happening. Do you think the fact that Hamas celebrated this, and one of the statements, for example, they made is that, they congratulated this new shift in power and said they hope that this new leadership will be sympathetic to the Palestinian cause as well. So kind of extending a little bit of that hand to see if those sentiments are reciprocated. Do you think the fact that Hamas has this position will pose any challenges or concerns for the greater resistance and the loyalties?
Well, I think we have to remember that the great martyr Yahya Sinwar spoke positively about the role of Syria,
Right.
and that I think is something that people should always keep in mind. The people actually who are doing the fighting, the people who are making sacrifices, I think they are more realistic about the needs of the Palestinian people. And we also have to keep in mind that the statement made by Hamas, it was made was delayed, and that is because Hamas was in a difficult position. Remember that many of the political leaders are based in Doha or in Istanbul or Ankara, and that as if they don't toe the line in some ways, that could have consequences for them, for their families, for their children. So it is understandable.
Right.
And for Iran, it's not really important what statement that Hamas makes, because Hamas is a resistance movement that wants to liberate the Palestinian people. Iran supports all of the Palestinian groups,
Right.
not just Hamas and Islamic Jihad. It supports every single Palestinian group that resists Israeli occupation, uh, and secular or religious. It's always done that. And even in 2012 and 13, Iran continued to support Hamas, and it will continue to do so from now on. I think the difference between Iran and Mr. Erdogan is that Iran's priority is Palestine.
Right.
Uh, Iran has made people can say what they like. But Iran has made huge sacrifices for the resistance over the last 4 decades. The sanctions against Iran are all about Palestine.
Right.
The difficulties, the economic difficulties that the Iranians have, despite the oil and gas wealth and the enormous size of the country, the difficulties that Iran has are because of the sanctions more than anything else. If there were no sanctions, Iran's economy would be very different today. And some in Iran say, why are we sacrificing for the Palestinians? There is that large segment of especially
Right.
liberals in the United States, in Iran, that
Mhm.
feel this way. The Iranians have funded the resistance. Everything that you see in Gaza, the capability, Iran does not make decisions in Gaza. It didn't know. Martyr Yahya Sinwar and his commanders decided
Right.
to attack this Israelis in response to decades of aggression and genocidal behavior. But all of their capabilities obviously came from Iran. And Iran will continue to support them, the broader resistance. And it doesn't matter for Iran whether there is a statement of congratulations or there isn't a statement of congratulations for Iran. The important thing is that the Palestinian people regain their rights and their dignity and their honor.
Right. And speaking about Iran and how you mentioned, and as we have seen, Iran fully being behind Palestine in both funding, ideologically, everything, many have also been critical of Iran in the recent months for not kind of stepping in to do disaster management, especially with the recent events that took place. And one thing that we also know is that Iran, as a country, cannot step in to take the matters of another country into its own hands without the permission and without the leadership of that own country. One thing that I also want to ask is it true that the Syrian government itself did not want Iran to step in that situation? And you've actually hinted in a previous interview that you think perhaps many of the officials in Syria were bought by the US and Israel, and maybe that could have been a reason why we saw how easy it was for Jolani to take power just like that. Do you think that's why all of this transpired the way that it did?
That was a part of it. There were senior officers and others who were bought off. But that's not unsurprising. So I think any country, and you see that in any country, but when the economy collapses, it becomes easier to do so because when a general only earns like what, $40, $50 a month, and an ordinary terrorist earns much more than him, then of course that, creates corruption. But it's a combination of things. It was the emptying out of the economy. It was the mismanagement of the government. It was the sanctions. It was the occupation. It was the constant airstrikes against Syria. All of these combined weakened the country, and Mr. Assad gradually tilted more towards Saudi Arabia and Emirates, and they effectively did nothing important for it. So again, the Iranians were prepared to defend Syria against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Remember, the Iranians had problems with the Syrian government at the beginning of the unrest,
Right.
and crimes were committed, and the Iranians, and people can look that up, and the Iranian Supreme National Security Council, they criticize um, the Syrian government. The Iranian president openly criticized the Syrian government. But the Syrian government was no more dictatorial than the other Arab countries in West Asia and North Africa. Uh, the only difference was that the Syrians were steadfast on Palestine, and they were against American domination, and that meant Israeli domination. They were steadfast about regaining their territory. So there was a difference between al-Assad and the other Arab leaders in that respect. Otherwise, it's not as if he was any worse than others. All the Syrians who died as a result of the dirty war. The dirty war, both sides fought. So when Mr. Erdogan brought in ISIS with financial support from the Persian Gulf and NATO, they killed Syrians. They can't just pretend that it was the Syrian government. But so the Iranians were critical of the Syrian government.
Right.
But for the Iranians, that to bring in ISIS and Al-Qaeda, that is not legitimate opposition.
Mhm.
For Iran, if there's a legitimate opposition that is not controlled by foreign powers, then they have every right to participate in Syrian civil society. But for the Americans to bring in, remember, Iran, the hatred of Iranians for Saddam Hussein, I think, is known to everyone.
Yeah.
Saddam Hussein, with Western support and Soviet Union support, attacked Iran. He
Yeah.
used chemical weapons against Iranians. Twice, I survived twice from his chemical weapons. But Iran was fiercely against American occupation of Iraq. As an individual, I participated in the anti-war protests in London, and I was against the war. The Iranian government was against the war,
Right.
not because we liked Saddam Hussein. We hated Saddam Hussein, but the United States, when they tried to overthrow someone like Saddam Hussein, first of all, that's illegal. And second of all, the United States is doing it for the sake of Israel. And remember, Netanyahu supported the wars in Libya, supported the war in Iraq, and supported the dirty war in Syria. So these three countries that he mentioned and he worked on, it's obviously because he wants to undermine the countries surrounding the Israeli regime, to weaken them so that Israel could rule supreme from the river to the sea.
Right. And one point I'd like to ask your opinion as well. One of the guests that we had on TMJ News a while ago told us that he believes if Iran had implemented the True Promise 3 operation, and if it did truly inflict the blow that it could have on the Israeli regime, that what happened in Lebanon and what we saw in Syria could have been prevented. Do you think that this is the case? Could it have been a blow large enough to prevent what we saw happen recently, or do you think what we have seen happen would have been going on anyway?
No, what we saw in Syria was basically Mr. Erdogan and Netanyahu and Biden using this opportunity where Hezbollah is facing Israel to strike Syria. And again, I know that they didn't think that they would go all the way to Damascus.
Right.
He just wanted more leverage. And if Erdogan was so principally against President Assad, why was he trying to normalize ties with President Assad for so long?
Right.
I mean, this inconsistency is something that I think should always be kept in mind. No, I don't think that True Promise 2, if it happened earlier, would have stopped Israelis from it would have stopped the martyrdom of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. I don't see any link. If it happened like 2 weeks before, what change would that do? If the Israelis felt that they could murder Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, they'd do it when the time comes.
Right.
And True Promise 3, I don't think it has a link to Syria. The reason why True Promise 2 was delayed was because the Americans were talking, if you recall back then, they were saying we're negotiating a ceasefire in
Right.
Gaza. And even though I never believed that there was going to be a ceasefire, some in Iran did, but I don't think that the key people in Iran did. But they did not want to be seen, because if Iran carried out True Promise 2 during the negotiations, then the Americans and the Israelis would have said, oh, we were about to sign a deal, and because of the Iranians
Right.
want to use the Palestinian people for their own strategic purposes. They never cared about the Palestinian people. They ruined the ceasefire
Right.
negotiations. That's what they would have done. And the whole of the media would have repeated it, even though it would have been a lie. So
Right.
Iran delayed it so that they would not be able to wreck the ceasefire negotiations and blame the resistance. So that there was a reason for that delay. The reason why it's delayed now, I don't know. Everything. I don't know what goes on behind closed doors,
Right.
but I think part of it is calculations that the Iranians have to make. If Iran strikes the Israeli regime and the Americans decide to make the stupid move to attack Iran, then Iran has to prepare its air defenses for not just the Israeli regime, but the United States and the Israelis. And it would also have to prepare its missile and drone capabilities to strike back at both Americans across the Persian Gulf region, where in all those places where they have military bases, and the Israeli regime. So Iran has to be prepared. It's
Right.
not just like you just lob a few missiles and it's not a computer game.
Mhm.
So the Iranians have to make sure that whenever they punish the Israelis, that they are prepared to defend themselves in case of any stupidity on behalf of the regime or any foolishness on behalf of Washington.
Absolutely. And do you think if and when this attack does come, or not attack, but retaliation, when it does happen, do you think that it will significantly change the dynamics of what's going on in the region? Will it have any impact on what we're seeing in Syria or the power of the resistance to respond in Palestine? What specific impact do you think that would have?
Remember this. your viewers should always remember this. If the Iranians or Hezbollah or Ansarullah wanted to sell out the Palestinian cause, they could have done it for the last 14 months, and especially the first year, the first 12 months.
Right.
They could have sold them out and received huge concessions, and they still can. And they still can. So it's those who are skeptical or cynical or irrationally hostile for whatever reason, they should always keep that in mind, that Iran has paid a heavy price, a price that a significant portion of Iranians, and not the majority, but a significant portion, believe it's too high, even though most of those people who believe it's too high, they too will support the cause in general. But Iran, when it strikes, without a doubt, its intention will be to change the equation and to strengthen, to make sure the Israeli regime and its supporters recognize Iran's power and the power of the resistance, and for them to change their behavior. They of course are sinister actors, and we expect nothing good to come out of Tel Aviv. But the hope is that that will make them change their calculations.
And you mentioned how Iran has paid a heavy price. And one view that you also shared is that some Iranians do believe that a large portion of the population itself is paying that price as well, especially for those who are living under heavy sanctions. I kind of want to draw a parallel between Iran and Syria, since a lot of what you mentioned about what Syrians have been going through in terms of their economy, sanctions, the struggles that average Syrians are facing are also parallels we can draw to many who are living in Iran as well. And I think it's important to also draw that, similarity if, and this is a huge if, but do you think that what happened in Syria, any chance that it could also happen to a country like Iran, especially given, Israel and its ambitions of expanding within the region, taking down countries one by one? Do you think that a similar situation to Syria, Libya, even Iraq could also transpire in Iran at any point?
Well, that's what the Americans would love to see. That's what European leaders would love to see. But Iran is not Syria, and Iran is a different country altogether. Iran is not, the Iranian leader is not Mr. Erdogan. If you recall, when Trump threatened sanctions on Turkey over a pastor who was arrested by the Turkish government, Erdogan kneeled and handed him over, even though he accused him of taking part in the coup. But Iran is suffering under what's called maximum pressure sanctions. In other words, Biden, Trump, over the past 7 years, they've done their best to strangle the Iranian economy. And they have hurt the Iranian economy substantially. But Iran is a resilient country. It is a powerful country. And it is the most powerful country in West Asia, largely due to the fact they've been able to stand up to the United States. So on the one hand, we've gone through many difficulties and hardship, but also it has strengthened the country, the people. It is a resilient people, and I have no doubt that the Iranians will be able to come out stronger. And I'm absolutely certain that the axis of resistance will grow stronger, and that the Western camp, NATO, will not succeed. And I think Mr. Erdogan, he has betrayed the Palestinian people, but I think that the Turkish people, who are among the most staunch supporters of Palestinian cause, they will increasingly recognize, and so will people in Syria and elsewhere, recognize where the real resistance is coming from. And I think ultimately that will empower the axis of resistance. And I see the Israeli regime as fundamentally being defeated in the long run. They lost in Gaza. They lost in Lebanon. They could not gain a foothold in Lebanon. They've not been able to take Gaza. In the past, they'd go all the way to the Suez Canal or all the way to Beirut.
Right.
This time they couldn't. In Syria, they had success without a doubt, but the Israeli regime has been delegitimized in the eyes of the international community. And even in your country, the United States, the mood towards the Israeli regime has shifted. Imagine how it is across the global south and the
Right.
global majority. And I think that is the greatest defeat for the Israeli regime. And as the resistance or axis of resistance in future grows, I think this is the key element that will further weaken the regime in the coming years.
Right. And kind of in closing, and to wrap this into a little bit of a larger picture in terms of the ripple effects that what happened in Syria could have in the region as well, you also said how chaos in Syria is basically bad news for all countries in the region. And you also referenced a call that took place between al-Julani and the fighters in China, where he said, after Damascus, we can free East Turkestan. And this is an issue that TMJ News has also covered, the Uyghurs in China, and it kind of brings into perspective that whole issue. That's one of the issues that is also present in the region and could be affected by what we're seeing in Syria as well. The topic that came up, which a lot of Muslims as well were supporting, was the Uyghur Muslims and the huge amount of backlash that came out against China for creating these concentration or re-education camps, as people called it. And, mainstream was reporting on how there were torturing happening there. There was brainwashing happening there because these were, these Uyghurs were like extremists who wanted to essentially had their separatist agendas and wanted to create an independent East Turkestan. Can you also weigh in a little bit about that issue and whether we're going to see kind of the rise of similar situations coming up within the region because of Syria now?
Well, first of all, what Mr. Erdogan has done by training many thousands of Chinese terrorists and many thousands of Central Asian terrorists from Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and across Central Asia is that he's going to complicate his relationship with all of these countries and Russia as well.
Right.
But I find it very convenient for some people in the Muslim community to be so worried about the Muslims in China and so much in line with Western mainstream media, yet they do not seem to show the same amount of enthusiasm about the violations that are taking place against people in their own countries or the countries of origin or in Gaza. Does anyone really believe that whatever is happening in China has any similarity with what's happening in Gaza? There's no comparison. Absolutely no comparison. Yet the focus, it's very obvious that the West has an objective to put the focus elsewhere. Does anyone think that some of the countries in our region, in North Africa, that they're um, the these family dictatorships, that they are any better than the countries that the United States antagonizes? Again, I think that we have to be very careful that the Western Empire is always tries to uh, create divisions and to distract attention away from what they're doing. Um, what By bringing in foreign fighters, fighters from Central Asia, fighters from across Asia, um, who's benefiting? It's only NATO,
Right.
because unrest and instability in Central Asia, in China, in South Asia, and elsewhere only brings down is only a threat to the Asian economy. Which economies are rising now today? It's the Asian economies. Which countries are on the decline? It is the West.
Right.
So I think we should be more sophisticated in the way in which we look at these issues. Obviously, China is not a utopia, but I think that when we look at the entire Arab world and beyond, the situation isn't isn't any better than in China. So again, I think that the biggest concern for the Islamic world and for the global international community, whether Muslim or Christian or Jew or Hindu or whatever, is the Palestinian issue.
Right.
And we could not allow this to become sidelined. This is the number one issue. And we should not be fooled by Western narratives. And we should not be unwittingly partners in policies pursued by the West, because we've seen what the West does and what it has been doing to Lebanon, to Palestine, to Syria, to Iraq, to Libya, to
Right.
Yemen, Venezuela, to Cuba. The list goes on.
Right. And to kind of in closing, one thing that you mentioned and I think is worth emphasizing for the ending of this conversation is that awareness and the spirit of awareness about the issue of Palestine has definitely been growing a lot in the United States as well. I know the mainstream doesn't necessarily always, as you said, represent those minority voices, but they're definitely a growing voice in this society. I think a lot more in parts of Europe, but here as well. And I think it's important to acknowledge that as well because it's something that we don't normally see covered. But I think a lot of people, especially with the protests this past year that university students were doing and the encampments that we saw coming out of a lot of universities, with a lot of students who were paying the price for their activism, they were being doxxed, they were being, harassed, their career opportunities were being jeopardized by the activism they were doing. And still, they were continuing that because we kind of saw an unprecedented shift in the, especially news sources that a lot of young adults were going after. Now it was no longer just referencing CNN or New York Times or, Washington Post. It was a lot of them going after independent journalists and, social media figures who were showing the realities of what's happening on the ground. And those images and the realities and videos that were coming out were really speaking to a lot of these young adults. As a professor yourself, what would be, your take on these changes that, you're seeing from Iran looking at, the Western countries and the growing activism? And what would be your message to these students?
I would say be careful about Western media. They are desperate to preserve the Israeli regime. Whenever you see the Western media supporting one side nowadays, you can be pretty sure that that is not in the interest of the people of West Asia and North Africa. And whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in Yemen, wherever it is in our region, you can be absolutely certain that whatever Western media is saying is in the interest of the Israeli regime. And if we fall into the trap of Western media and we follow their policies and support those policies, then we deserve what they get. We deserve what we get, and they
Right.
get what they want.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Professor Marandi, for joining us on TMJ News. We really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for your knowledgeable insights on this issue.
Thank you very much for having me.